Okay, hello everybody. I hope everyone hears me. Okay, and I first have to say that the topic I was asked to talk about was not a topic that I chose. It is not a topic that I necessarily have a tremendous amount of insight. It's an extraordinarily difficult problem, both in terms of halacha and in terms of emotional turmoil and pain. And I think the first thing that has to be said is that if one is dealing with issues of gender confusion or the like, there needs to be a very, very close collaboration between one's spiritual advisors and mental health professionals. This is where the rabbi must work with therapists and social workers, together with the family and together with the young man or woman that is going through this very, very difficult struggle in order to emerge in a good place, however that's going to be defined. So in many ways, I can just stop there and say this is what you have to do. But I was asked to talk about a little bit and the issue of gender confusion, gender identity. Why is it becoming so much of a bigger problem than perhaps it ever was historically? And let me start off by saying that the notion of gender confusion breaks down into a number of separate issues, and the issues are not necessarily related. First, we can go back all the way to the 1960s, in which we have the issues of feminism and the various arguments that Orthodox Judaism or Torah Judaism does not respect women, and it does not give women their right place, and they are excluded from positions of authority like the rabbinate and the like. And those issues are still very much alive even today, very, very controversial. I will not be giving a share on that other than to remark that the Torah in no way considers women to be inferior to men. Both men and women are made in the image of God. Both men and women express in their personalities and in their neshamot fundamental aspects of the totality of the divine essence. God is not male or female. God is a totality that encompasses both. And the fact that in traditional Judaism, men and women have different roles and different functions and different ways of expressing their spirituality is not a judgment of inferiority or superiority. It is simply a recognition that people are different, and indeed within the halachic structure, a concept of separate but equal has a tremendous amount of validity. Many of you might remember the very eminent social psychologist Carol Gilligan, a professor at Harvard University, who demonstrated in a very path-breaking work, A Different Voice, going back to the 1970s, that boys and girls saw the world in a very different way. And this was actually part of their genetic makeup. This was not a result of environmental influences. She administered a test where the hypothetical was that your child is sick and your child needs medicine, and the only medicine is in a drugstore that is closed for the night. And if you don't get your child the medicine, he or she might die. What do? Every boy, without exception, said, you take a rock and you break the window and you take the medicine, which of course is a good answer. But the girls said, be sure to leave a note or call the police ahead of time. In other words, the concept was men tended to focus on the immediate, most important issue with a laser-like intensity. Women had a greater sensitivity to the template of relationships, primary and secondary, that are implicated in any particular course of action. And since this test was administered to children between 5 and 7, Professor Gilligan wanted to demonstrate that men are hardwired to kind of be binary thinkers, this or that, and women are hardwired to kind of see a deeper, more contextual, interrelated reality. Without getting into all the specifics, that itself is an idea that God made men and women to be different, and respecting those differences is not a put down of women. It is actually giving them the most profound respect, because there is nothing more degrading for women than to be told that you can achieve your identity and your enrichment only by imitating whatever it is that men do. That is the ultimate put down. And even the so-called second wave of feminism or post-feminism has come to recognize that the celebration of the uniqueness of the woman is actually a deeper and richer way to go, rather than simply trying to compete with whatever it is that men are doing. So that's one source of gender confusion. And again, these issues are still very much alive, in which women want to have men's roles, etc. And there's kind of a confusion as to what are the appropriate boundaries. A second issue of gender confusion is the prevalence of same-sex attraction, in which, although obviously there have always been gay and lesbian people, they've been around, that's why the Torah addresses those issues. But many more people are coming to the forefront today, many more people are identifying. These various alternative lifestyles are not simply tolerated, but they are endorsed, they are legitimated, etc. That, of course, does raise some very, very severe religious, ethical questions that we have to deal with. And the third, which I think is really the most complicated, is the great, great increase in transgenderism, in which boys want to be girls, girls want to be boys. There has been an absolutely dramatic increase in this phenomenon just over the past decade. And once again, this raises enormous problems, psychological, emotional, medical, and certainly halachic as well. Let me point out that traditionally, the idea of a person believing that they were the gender that they were not born with, that the boy thinking they are really a girl, and this can happen to adults as well, or the girl thinking she is really a boy, actually does have a label, gender dysphoria. Traditionally, gender dysphoria was regarded as a psychiatric illness in the DSM-5 manual of psychiatric disorders. In recent years, it is no longer treated as an illness, except if it's connected to other types of phenomena like suicide or anxiety. And today it is treated as a legitimate life choice. And that itself is a highly questionable situation. Let me just say a few things here. The first thing that I want to point out is that there is a very powerful thought that is promulgated by Rav Kook and Rav Tzadok and other thinkers, that sometimes there are very powerful ideas. And in those ideas, there's a great holiness, a sanctity, a type of idea that can bring us to a new level of understanding and connection to God. But the powers of evil in the world can take even a legitimate and godly idea and pervert it and misdirect it into channels that are destructive. But our challenge is not necessarily to reject the idea, but to understand that you have to find a way to extract the kernel of holiness that is within it and liberate it, in Kabbalistic terms, from the kalipa, from the shell that traps it and degrades it and darkens it and prevents its light from emerging. Feminism, for example, is exactly that type of movement. The idea that in the world, there is both a male and a female element, and both of those elements are components of God. God himself is said, God is beyond gender, but God himself has masculine and feminine elements. The whole imagery of Lurianic Kabbalah is kind of the union of the masculine and feminine within the Godhead. Obviously, these are ideas that are perhaps a little too deep to fully explore, even if I would be capable of exploring them. And therefore, within every human being that is in the image of God, there is a masculine and a feminine element. Within every man, there are aspects of the woman. Within every woman, there are aspects of the man. The man in an ideal state is predominantly male, but there will also be a feminine component. And ideally, the woman would be predominantly female, but there would be a masculine component. Because male and female itself represents the completion of the spiritual energy that brings God into the world, because essentially it mimics what is going on within God himself. So the notion of the feminine entering the world by women assuming greater and greater dignity and importance in society, and even the notion of men nurturing within themselves perhaps the sensitivity of the feminine, and women trying to become more aggressive in the sense of being actors in the world, accentuating aspects of their masculinity, is not in itself something that is evil. There is a certain goodness in that integration, in that synthesis, in that harmonization, in that balance. Indeed, the Vilna Gaon writes that men are compared to the sun and women are compared to the moon. But as we approach the Messianic era, the light of the moon shall become equal to the light of the sun, and therefore the ascendance of women in all spheres of life is part of the spiritual development that brings us to the coming of the Mashiach. But what happens is good and valid ideas get converted, get appropriated, get distorted, get twisted in the confusion and in the darkness of society. And therefore, what might have been holy and noble and good turns into pathologies and sickness, a source of great, great misery. So the fact that we find an increase in feminism, just in terms of equality and questions about roles, in same-sex attraction, and even in transgender, can, in a very strange way, and I hope I'm not being too controversial here, represent certain elements of kedusha that have been trapped and distorted and misdirected. And how do you extract it? How do you identify what is legitimate, what is not? It's a very, very complicated phenomenon. But we need to understand that many, many good ideas are plunged into the darkness and the confusion of the society in which these ideas emerge. We are told that by the Mabul, by the flood, the generation of the flood, which was a generation of immorality and sin, Hishchit kol basar, all of the flesh was corrupted. And Rashi says the level of immorality was so great that even animals were having relations with other animals of a different species. And the Beis Halevi points out, how can that happen? I mean, animals act on instinct. Animals are programmed to mate with their species. A dog is not going to mate with a sheep or a goat. An elephant is not going to mate with a tiger. What's going on? And the Beis Halevi explains that when you live in an environment of sin, immorality, egotism, and selfishness, and even if that comes from initially volitional choices, human beings have free will, it literally contaminates the very atmosphere of the world, so that even animals are affected, even plants are affected. Everything gets perverted. Things that should be instinctual in one direction gets turned into another direction. So the elephant will be with the tiger and the cow will be with the dog. Not because the animals chose to do anything evil, but they simply get affected by the atmosphere of licentiousness and sin that society produces. Certainly, I think we've seen this very, very much in terms of the rise of all of these different deviancies, same-sex attraction, transgender. No one is blaming any particular individual. Many individuals have psychological disabilities. Many individuals have been traumatized. Many individuals have gone through severe abuse. My feeling, I think anyone's feeling, towards people who are struggling with this must surely be one of compassion and love, and to try to help people navigate this difficult path. I'm not here at all to look down or cast aspersions on adolescents or even older people that are struggling with this. I appreciate the pain of that struggle. But I have to say that to some level, whether you consider there to be some type of genetic component or not, we are all affected by the environment that society has created. And society has created an environment where these are not even problems, these are just alternative lifestyles. And you can't deal with a problem or a crisis unless it is identified as a problem or a crisis. If it's simply going to be an alternative, there are no incentives to change. There are no incentives to work out something. There are no incentives to try to live a life that is consistent with the Torah, because there's nothing wrong. The Gemara says in Maseches Chulin that the city of Sodom and Amorah were destroyed in part because of their sexual immorality, particularly sodomy, which is the term that's even used today for homosexual sexual relations. But the Gemara in Chulin makes a remarkable point. Sodom and Amorah were not destroyed until they started writing a ketubah for same-sex marriage. A ketubah is the marriage contract. What is the point that the Gemara is making? A society that sins, that engages in deviant behavior, that's very bad. But if it recognizes a standard that they're not living up to, God can have tolerance and forgiveness, because at least there's not a blurring of the distinction between right and wrong. There is a right, there is a wrong. Sometimes I can live with the standard, sometimes I don't live with the standard. All of us sin, all of us are imperfect in various ways. But we don't redefine the standard. But when you start defining the wrong to be right, when you start elevating the deviant to be an equally valid or even superior lifestyle, when you write a ketubah for a same-sex marriage, when you give a sheva brachos and a chuppah to violations of the Torah, that is a very different thing than sinning. The sinner recognizes that they're sinning. But the true destruction comes when the sin is no longer defined as a sin. And this is a very powerful statement in the Gemara, that Sodom was destroyed not because they practiced homosexual relationships, but because they legitimated it with the sanctity of a religious ceremony. That, I think, has direct relevance to the same-sex marriage issue that we're talking about. Now, let me point out, the Gemara's Maseches Chulin. Let me point out that even the psychological community has begun to recognize this phenomenon in the context of transgender. As I said before, the transgender movement has exploded absolutely in recent years. Boys want to be girls, girls want to be boys. There are hormone therapy and even sex assignment surgeries that are going on at a really young age, sometimes 10 or 11. Decisions are being made. And some psychologists, granted, I think they're a minority, but they have identified a phenomenon that they call, it actually has a name, rapid onset gender dysphoria. Rapid onset literally means it's kind of a social contagion in which a teenage girl sees her classmates interested in transgenderism, and they form a Facebook group or some type of social media group, and it basically becomes almost something in which, hey, my friends are doing it, I want to be part of my friends. Or it might be just an alternative to the normal anxieties that people might have with their bodies. And now it simply becomes an alternative to think about changing gender. But it's also very, very well established that even when one goes through the gender changes, the underlying psychological problems are often not addressed. The suicides, the depression, the anxieties, the regrets of irrevocable decisions, the loss of fertility, which is an automatic consequence of these types of treatments, are very, very serious. The fact that children who are minors even are being physically mutilated because of simply accepting their own self-diagnosis. And I have to say that the psychiatrists who have written about rapid onset gender dysphoria have leveled very serious charges against some of the therapeutic community, saying that they are complicit in immediately affirming a person's self-diagnosis against sometimes parental wishes, without even meeting the child in some of those cases, dismissing the parents' concerns by simply considering them valid. One very, very prominent leader, a very prominent therapist in the transgender community says the following, and she makes fun of parents. I'm going to read you a short quote. Another thing that's a showstopper around parents giving consent is the fertility issue. If the child goes directly from puberty blockers to cross-sex hormones, they are pretty much forfeiting their fertility and won't be able to have a genetically related child. There's a lot of parents who have dreams of becoming grandparents. It's very hard for them not to imagine those genetically related grandchildren. So we have to work with parents. These aren't your dreams. She laughs in the transcript. You have to focus on your child's dreams, what they want. And what I will say about many of the youth who want puberty blockers is, I've never met such an altruistic group of kids around adoption. Never. They say, I will adopt because there's so many children who need good homes. And they're trying to tell us that the most important thing is to be able to have every opportunity to have my gender affirmation be as complete as possible. Anything else is secondary. Again, there's a much longer quote, a much longer discussion. I think if you Google rapid onset gender dysphoria, you will see almost the criminal complicity of parts of the therapeutic community in really effecting a mutilation that not only imposes an extreme detriment on many, many children, but indeed does not solve and even aggravates the psychological problems that they face. A few points that I think need to be addressed. Let me spend a few moments, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, on some interesting halachos. There are some halachic aspects to the reassignment of gender. First of all, let me point out that there is an Isser Dioraisa, a Torah prohibition, against castration or sterilization. This is a Torah violation, unless one's life is in danger. So if one needs hysterectomy or the like because of cancer, uterine cancer, or cancer of the ovaries, that would be permitted. But even in terms of contraceptions, vasectomies or tubal ligations are not accepted methods of contraception because of sterilization. In fact, that's not our talk for tonight. Even spaying your pets is a halachic shaila. Even animals cannot be castrated or sterilized. So that's one thing that one has to keep in mind, that the very process of changing sexual gender involves sterilization, loss of reproductive functions, and you're dealing with Torah violations. Now, it is true that if in theory such an operation would be necessary to prevent a suicide, it might fall under pikuach nefesh. Yes, indeed, saving a life. But as I say, I believe the psychological literature establishes exactly the opposite. If someone was suicidal, this will not alleviate the risk. And indeed, it may create risks that were not there before. One has to keep that in mind. This is being marketed with a lot of false representations. A second point that's very interesting is, assuming the change does occur, what is the status of the child after the change? If a boy or a man becomes a woman through a surgical hormonal combination of hormone surgical procedure, are they halachically a man because that's how they were born? Or does halacha recognize ex post facto the phenomenon of change? So here, I have to say, according to most poskim, gender replacement surgery does not affect the halachic gender of the child. A boy who becomes a girl is actually still a boy, has to put on tefillin, has to do all of those mitzvahs. A girl who becomes a boy remains a girl. There is a das yachid, there is the individual view of Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, who actually says that after the fact, halacha might recognize gender assignment, but that is very much a das yachid. That is an individual view, and that is not how we generally paskin. But again, to go back to this in a more general way, the emergence within the male personality of female attributes, or the emergence within the female personality of male attributes, is not in and of itself something bad. Because in the shleimut of Bria, the world needs both, and since every individual is an olam katan, is a microcosm of the world, we incorporate both of those elements. That is what it means to be in the image of God, because God is both masculine and feminine. But what has tragically happened in a time of darkness, of egotism, of self-indulgence, of doing what you want just because you want to do it, which is so characteristic of the decadence of modern society. Legitimate, holy ideas get perverted and besmirched and corrupted into pathologies that not only violate the law of God, but that will definitively create human misery that will last for generations. This is a darkness that I believe is virtually unparalleled in human history. Certainly, In all generations, there has been decadence, there has been sin, there has been immorality. I'm not going to say here that this is the most immoral generation that ever lived. But this particular confusion, at least there were some things in life that you were sure of. I might be a murderer, I might be a thief, but at least I'm a man or you're a woman. Now, things that were so axiomatic that they were not even subject to debate have been thrown into confusion. A disintegration of the very definition of human identity. And all we can say is hope and pray that just as the night is darkest before the dawn, perhaps this is characteristic of the tremendous, tremendous darkness that will precede the coming of Mashiach and the coming of redemption. You know, we've been through a very difficult time generally. The pandemic, the COVID pandemic, that's why we're still teaching through Zoom, in which perhaps millions of people have died throughout the world. And terrorism, and certainly in the United States, the rise of anti-Semitism. All sorts of things are confusing. We thought we had a handle on technology. We thought we had a handle on public health. We thought we had a handle on medicine. We thought we had a handle on democracy and civilization. And everything is spinning out of control and just falling apart. Things that were axiomatic can no longer be assumed as accepted. And in a general way, what this is saying is that maybe before the Mashiach comes, we have to know that we're not in charge of anything. We have to be reduced to a state of utter helplessness. Because then and only then do we realize that our salvation only comes from God. The Maharal writes that messianic redemption is described as a seed. Semach, there'll be a growth coming out of that seed. And the Maharal points out that before a seed produces either grain or a tree, it totally disintegrates into the ground. So too, before Mashiach comes, we are totally disintegrated. We realize we're out of control. We realize we're not in charge. We realize that all of the things that we took for granted can no longer be taken for granted. Ein lanu lihisha'en ela al avinu shebashamayim. Excuse me, we have no one that we can rely upon except HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when we reach that state of helplessness and despair, that is when God says, I will come and redeem you, because you've come to the realization that you're powerless. Again, when I look at the decadence that is rampant in society, I too often feel a sense of despair, a sense of hopelessness, a sense of powerlessness. But that is the precursor to redemption. Again, I do want to repeat, because there may be people listening in the audience who are personally going through these struggles, either themselves or within their families, that I'm not here to offer condemnation. I have compassion for the struggle. I know that it's difficult. But society has turned into such a negative direction of perversity that it almost becomes a river that you can't turn back. And it's important that all of us have a perspective to understand that these are sicknesses, not lifestyle decisions. And as sicknesses, they may be very, very tragic, but they have to be addressed as sicknesses and then treated with the appropriate therapies. Maybe they'll work, maybe they won't work. No treatment is 100% successful. But without recognizing something as a problem or a deviance, then it will never be corrected, it will never be improved because there's nothing wrong with it. And when we stop understanding the difference between right and wrong, we're on a path where tshuva almost becomes impossible. Because how do you do tshuva if there's nothing wrong in what you're doing? So, as I say, I don't have a lot to say about all of this, other than to point out that the psychological, well, I don't want to blame, there are many wonderful therapists, but a great segment of the psychological therapeutic community bears a real responsibility for creating this situation. And it is a travesty and it is a crime for which they should be held accountable. And Baruch Hashem, this has been identified by other members of the psychiatric and psychological community. It is akin, just like the Wuhan lab, the most recent stories are responsible for releasing the COVID virus. Well, I think to some degree, the psychiatric community is responsible for releasing what Carl Jung, the great Carl Jung, described in a different context as a psychic epidemic, an epidemic of hysteria that is literally spread by endorsement and validation of various situations that should not have been allowed to be legitimated in that way. I just want to point out, though, speaking from a little bit of a Kabbalistic standpoint, that there are very, very interesting sources. And again, I don't know how to integrate this with everything I've been saying, but there are some interesting Kabbalistic sources that do talk about a woman's neshama being incarnated within a man, or more often, a man's neshama being incarnated in a woman. One of the sources that is sometimes quoted is the story of Yosef and Dinah. If you remember, Rachel gave birth to Yosef, and Leah gave birth to Dinah. But according to Rashi, Dinah was originally a boy, and Yosef was originally a girl. And what happened was, Leah did not want Rachel to have a girl because that would leave Rachel with only one tribe, because that would mean that Leah would have the 11th child, and that would leave Rachel with only one child, and that would make her inferior to the maidservants. So Leah prayed that the girl be changed into the boy Yosef, and that the boy be changed into the girl Dinah. So some of the Mukubalim posit there was a certain aspect of masculinity in Dinah that made her kind of walk around publicly in areas that a girl would normally not go, namely Shechem. And there was a certain feminine aspect in Yosef that caused him to be involved with cosmetics and appearance. And that was seen as a little bit of a feminine soul in a masculine body, a masculine soul in a feminine body. Similarly, some quote a text in Maseches Eruvin, it's machlokas what the Girsa is, that Michal, the daughter of Shaul, wore tefillin, and some suggest once again there was a nitzutz, a spark of the masculine in her. Sifrei Chasidus talk about Yitzchak Avinu, had a feminine neshama until the Akedah, and that is why it says God answered his prayer, because the fertility problem was him, because as a feminine mating with a feminine, he could not have a child until his masculinity became emergent. These are ideas in Rav Chaim Vital which talks about these different types of Gilgulim. So these things do exist. And there is some suggestion that as we approach Yemot HaMashiach, there will be more of this irbuvia, more of this confusion, because different souls have to find their expression in different ways. So it is indeed a very, very confusing time. And as I say, with respect to any individual person, there must be compassion. And unfortunately, again, I myself know families that are going through the struggle, both in terms of same-sex attraction, which in some ways is easier. It's a hard problem too. And then even transgender, which is actually a much more difficult problem to deal with. And we don't really have full answers. But I think it is important that we recognize our standards. We recognize what is right and what is wrong. We recognize what is Hashem's will and what is Hashem's Torah. And then we endeavor to apply those rules with compassion, with rachamim, and with understanding the pain and the challenges that people are going through. Again, my prayer simply is that this problem should go down. Perhaps, as I indicated before, the whole phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria suggests that if society itself would redefine the phenomenon, that gufa, that itself would have an impact on its prevalence. That itself would be a major step in reducing the phenomenon. We hope that that will be the case. And in either case, this should pave the way for the coming of Mashiach. I see there was a question, is transgenderism forbidden under the Noahide laws? The answer is yes, it is, simply because sterilization is forbidden under the Noahide laws, and sterilization will generally be a consequence of the change in gender. So again, I apologize. Again, the topic was not of my own choosing, and I was very hesitant to address it. But I hope I did not insult anyone, or I hope this was not too difficult for people to hear. But it is an issue that we need to kind of think about a little bit, and hopefully, B'ezrat Hashem, we should not have to face it in our own lives and in the lives of our children. Thank you very much, and much hatzlacha.